But Not Buddy, Chapter 8, Part 2, pages 78 through 87. I went back to the big fire to sit with Bugs. The mouth organ man said, "I suppose you boys are going out on the train tomorrow." I said, "The one for Chicago, sir?" He said, "That's the one." I said, "Yes, we are, sir." He said, "Well, you'd be best to get as much sleep as you can. It's supposed to be pulling out at 5:15, but you never know with these freights." We got in one of the shacks with some other boys. Bugs was snoring in 2 seconds, but I couldn't sleep. I opened my jackknife and put it under my blanket. I was thinking, Jesus' mama was right. Someone who doesn't know who their family is like dust blowing around in a storm. They don't really belong any one place. I started wondering if going to California was the right thing to do. I might not know who my family was, but I knew they were out there somewhere, and it seemed to me to make a whole lot more sense to think that they were somewhere around Flint instead of out west. I opened my suitcase to get my blanket. Even though I trusted the woman who guarded it for me, I checked to make sure everything was okay. I picked up the tobacco pouch that had my rocks in it and pulled the drawstring open. I shook the 5 smooth stones out and looked at them. They had been in the drawer after the ambulance took Mama away, and I had them ever since. Someone had took a pen or something and had writ on all 5 of them, but it was writ in a code so I couldn't understand what they meant. One of them said, Kentland Ill, 5:10:11. Another said, La Goody Inn, 5:16:11. Then there was Sturgis M, 8:30:12, and Gary Inn, 6:13:12. And the last one said Flint M, 8:11:11. I put them back in the pouch and pulled the string tight. Then I pulled out the envelope that had the picture of a saggy pony at the Miss B. Gotten Moon Park. It was fine. Next, I counted the flyers again. All 5 were there. I slid them all back except for the blue one. I held it up so it could catch some of the light from the big fire. I kept looking at the picture and wondering why this one bothered Mama so much. The more I thought about it, the more I knew this man just had to be my father. Why else would Mama keep these? I used a little trick to help me fall off to sleep. I pulled my blanket right up over my head and breathed in the smell real deep. After doing this 3 times, the smells of the shack in Hooverville were gone, and the only smell of the blanket was in my nose. And that smell always reminded me of Mama and how she used to read to me to sleep every night. I took 2 more breaths and pretended I was hearing Mama reading to me about the billy goat's gruff, or the fox and the grapes, or the dog that saw his reflection in the water, or some other story she'd check out of the library. I could hear Mama's voice getting farther and farther away as I imagined I was in the story, until finally her voice and the story all mixed into one. I learned that it was best to try to be asleep before Mama finished the story, because if she got done and I was still awake, she'd tell me what the story was about. I never told Mama, but that always ruined the fun of the story. Shucks, here I was thinking I was just hearing something funny about a fox or a dog, and Mama had spoiled it by telling me they were really lessons about not being greedy or not wishing for things you couldn't have. I took 2 more breaths and started thinking about the little hen that baked the bread. I heard, "Not I," said the pig. "Not I," said the goat. "Not I," said the big bad wolf. Then whoop zoop sloop, I was asleep. I started dreaming about the man with the giant fiddle. He was walking away, and I kept calling him, but he couldn't look back. Then the dream got a lot better. I turned away from where Herman E. Calloway was, and there stood Deeza Malone. I told her, "I really like your dimple." She laughed and said, "See you in 7 years." A man screamed, "Get up! They're trying to sneak it out early." I jumped straight up and banged my head on the top of the shack. I ran outside. It was still dark and the fire was just a pile of glowing sticks. The man was screaming at the top of his lungs, "Get up! They fired the engine and they're fixing to take off." Bugs and the other boys came out and stood next to me. Bugs said, "Is it a raid?" Someone said, "No, they're trying to sneak it out before we get up." People started running all over Hooverville. Bugs said, "Come on, Bud, get your stuff. We got to get on that train." I folded my blanket up and put it in my suitcase and tied the twine back. I put my jackknife in my pocket and Bugs and I ran outside. I hadn't gotten 6 giant steps away when a boy stuck his head out of the door and yelled, "Hey, Slim, is this your paper?" I looked back. "Oh, my blue flyer! I forgot to put it back in my suitcase." Bugs said, "Hurry! I'll wait. I'll catch you. Go ahead." I ran back and took my flyer from the boy. "Thanks a lot." I ran back out into the crowd that was tearing through the woods. There were 1,000,000 men and boys running in the same direction. I didn't want to fold the flyer up, so as I was running, I slid it between the twine and the suitcase. I'd put it back inside once I got on the train. No one was talking. All you could hear were the sounds of 1,000,000 feet smacking on the trail, and this and the sounds of 1,000,000 people trying to catch their breath. Finally, a hiss sound started getting louder and louder, and I knew we weren't too far away. We broke out of the woods, and there in the dark sat the train. The locomotive was hissing and spitting coal black smoke into the sky. Every once in a while, a big shower of sparks would glow up from the inside the dark cloud, making it look like a gigantic black genie was trying to raise up out of the smokestack. The train went as far back as you could see. There must have been 1,000 boxcars, but everyone had stopped and it was just standing there watching. No one was trying to get on. I pushed my way to the front to see if I could find Bugs, and I saw why everyone had stopped. There were 4 cop cars and 8 cops standing between the crowd and the train. The cops all had billy clubs and were spread out to protect the train. The crowd kept getting bigger and bigger. One of the cops yelled, "You men know you can't get on this train. Just go back to Shantytown and there won't be no trouble." A white man said, "This is the only train going west for the next month. You know we got families to feed and we've got to be on it. You go back to your cars and you'll be right. There won't be no trouble." The cop said, "I'm a warning you, the Flint police are on the way. This here is private property and they have orders to shoot anyone who tries to get on this train." A man next to me said, "I'd rather be shot than sit around and watch my kids go hungry." The cop said, "This is America, boys. You're sounding like a bunch of commies. You know I can't let you on this train." "I got kids to feed too, and I'd lose my job." Someone yelled, "Well, welcome to the club, brother." It seemed like we stood looking at the cops and them looking at us for a whole hour. Our side was getting bigger and bigger, and the cops started looking nervous. The one who was doing all the talking saw them fidgeting and said, "Hold steady, men." One of the cops said, "Jake, there's 400 men out there and more coming. I don't like these odds. Mr. Pinkerton ain't paying me enough to do this." He threw his cop hat and his billy club on the ground. Everyone froze when the train whistle blew one long time and the engine started saying, "Shush, shush, shush, shush." And the big steels creaked a couple of times, then started moving. 4 of the other cops threw their hats and billy clubs down too. The boss cop said, "You lily-livered rats." And it was like someone said, "On your mark, get set, go." The engine was saying, "Shush, shush, 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 shush," and a million boys and men broke for the train. I got pushed from behind and fell on top of my suitcase. Someone reached down and pulled me up. I squeezed my bag to my stomach and ran. The train was going faster and faster, and people were jumping on and reaching back to help others. I finally got to the tracks and was running as hard as I could. I looked up into a boxcar and saw Bugs. He screamed, "Bud, throw me your bag! Throw me your bag!" I used both hands to throw my suitcase at the train. Bugs caught it, and when he set it behind him, the blue flyer blew out of the twine and fluttered outside the door. But it was like a miracle. The flyer flipped over 3 times and landed right in my hand. I slowed down and put it in my pocket. Bud reached one arm and out and screamed, "Bud, don't stop! Run!" I started running again, but it felt like my legs were gone. The car with Bugs in it was getting farther and farther away. Finally, I stopped. Bugs was leaning out the door and stopped reaching back for me. He waved at a distance into the box. He waved and disappeared into the boxcar. A second later, my suitcase came flying out the door. I walked over to where it landed and picked it up. Man, this is one tough suitcase. You couldn't even tell what it has been through. It still looked exactly the same. I sat at the side of the tracks and tried to catch my breath. The train and my new pretend brother got farther and farther away, chugging to Chicago. Man, I finally found some family, and he was gone before we could even get to know each other. There were 6 or 7 other people who didn't make the train, so we all walked back to Hooverville. They must have lit the big fire again. The sky in that direction was glowing orange. The cop that first threw down his billy club walked over to us and said, he wasn't lying about the Flint police coming, but they're coming to bust up Shantytown. Y'all should get out of here. When we got close to Hooverville, we heard 4 gunshots. We all spread into the woods and sneaked up to see what had happened. I peeked from behind a tree and could see a bunch of cops standing around with pistols out. All the men and boys and women that were left in Hooverville were bunched up on one side and the cops were on the other. The fire that had been lit and was burning bigger than ever, but now it was burning because the cops were tearing all the shacks down and were throwing the wood and cardboard and hunks of cloth into the middle of it. One of the cops dragged the big clothes washing pot over to the side and stuck his pistol down in it and shot 4 more times. Whew! Instead of shooting people, they were shooting holes in all their pots and pans. A man was yelling, "You yellow belly lowlifes, you waited until you knew most of the men were gone. You cowards." The cops wouldn't talk or nothing. They just kept piling Flint Hooverville into the fire. I tried to see if I could spot Diesel Malone, but there were too many people. It seemed like the only good thing that came out of going to Hooverville was that I finally kissed a girl. Maybe someone was trying to tell me something, what with me missing the train and the blue flyer floating back to me. Maybe Diesel Malone was right. Maybe I should stay here in Flint. I walked back further into the woods and sat down. I pulled the blue flyer out of my pocket and opened my suitcase back up. I smoothed the flyer out and took another good look at it. Maybe it came floating right back to me because this Herman E. Calloway really was my father. Wait a minute. I sat up. The names Caldwell and Calloway are a lot alike. Both of them have 8 letters, and there aren't too many names that have a C, a L, and a W all together like that. I remember what I read in the Little Big Book Gangbusters. It said a good criminal chooses an alias That's kind of close to their own name. Except I couldn't figure out who was a criminal here and why anybody needed an alias. I wanted to stay and look for Deeza and her mother, but it was too hard to hear all the people crying and arguing. Besides, I was still on the lam. I started walking. If I hurried, I could get breakfast at the mission.